We are actually starting our new series today called Worlds Apart. And so if you guys are new, it's your first, second, or maybe it's your third time, you're still kind of new, this is a perfect time to kind of get started because it's a brand new series for us. And so you guys are walking in when it's kind of new for everyone around here. So I'm happy that you guys are here. My name is Tyler. I am the next generation pastor, so I kind of oversee middle school, high school, you guys, and I'm so happy that you're here. And if you're new here, I hope that you just feel welcome. Like, man, this is a cool place to be. I enjoy being here. So with this new series that we're starting today, it might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about anything awkward or a weird topic like we talked about with we've talked about sex and dating before. And it's everyone's they get really nervous about it. But this is a very real topic that we're talking about. And so what we're going to talk about today is the difference between science and faith. Now, at best, science and faith, they can seem like they're frenemies at best. They kind of know each other. They're kind of talking about the same things, but they still don't really get along very well. At worst, they can seem like there's no way they could actually ever get along. Because the reality is that science and faith can just feel worlds apart. They can feel like they're just separate from each other. Like they're two areas that can't possibly coexist. So we have this set because it's talking about what we a lot of times think is science and faith is a black and white issue. It's black and white. And so we think, okay, there's no way. Those are two separate things. Or you see over here, we have a globe and we have a bunch of science textbooks. And science is more like this is what the world thinks. And over here, we have some Bibles and a light which represents, well, actually, let me read this passage. John 8:12 says, I am the light of the world. This is Jesus speaking. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So if Jesus is the light and science is of the world, those just don't go hand in hand. Maybe you've sat in science class and learned some things about life, or you've learned about this earth, or maybe you learned just about humanity in general that left you doubting your faith. Maybe you've wondered, does evolution prove that God isn't real? Does scientific discovery discredit spirituality? Does scientific evidence prove that some Bible stories didn't happen the way that they actually did? So if we're all being honest, this might be the big question here. Can you believe science and still have faith in God? So let's be real. Doesn't it feel like we have to choose between science over here, the black and the white of faith? Doesn't it feel like that's what we have to do? Maybe you've heard a parent or a relative or someone in the church says, hey, be careful. You don't want to get too much into that science stuff because if you pay attention too much in that science class in school, you'll start losing your faith. Yet when you read your textbook or you listen to your teacher, it's a lot of times very hard to argue with what science has proven to be true. Whether you've talked about it out loud or if you haven't talked about it at all, I would guess we've probably all felt this tension that seems to exist between science and faith. We feel this tension. It's kind of like a rubber band, where science and faith seem like they're going opposite directions. You have them pulling in the faith-wise and then the science-wise, and they're pulling apart. And even if we couldn't call it that, it's just this really big pull that we realize it's one or the other, and which way am I supposed to go? And if they pull too far apart, it just seems like, it's just going to. It seems like science is trying to disprove God. That all the atheists are scientists. And if that's true, God must disprove science, right? So we can either only have faith or we can only have science. That's what we've kind of grown up believing. So you and I are left feeling like we have to choose between our faith in God and the scientific facts and theories. But while this is a very real conflict, did you know that this isn't always the case? It's not always this way. For a long time, as scientific theory and exploration was developing, everyone was learning about these scientific theories. Science and faith were not considered to be at odds. They weren't considered to be one side and the other. In fact, many great scientists in history didn't have to choose between faith and science. Many of them were actually Christians. So in the 1500s, a man named Copernicus, he taught humanity about the stars and the universe and based his scientific discoveries, stars and the universe based on his scientific discoveries. He is the person who first recognized that Earth revolved around the sun and not the sun revolving around the earth. And guess what? He was a Christian. A century later, in the 1600s, Galileo, how many of you ever heard the name Galileo? Okay? Galileo even made more discoveries, and chances are you've probably learned about him in history class or science class. He is known as the father of science, and what many of you may not know is that he was a Christian himself. Then in the 1700s, Sir Isaac Newton, you guys hopefully have heard about him. He formed some of the most important laws of physics that have since shaped human understanding of how things work. Those laws are still in your science textbooks. Sir Isaac Newton, he was a Christian. In the 1800s, William Kelvin, he discovered a ton about the way that heat and temperature work. And so any of you heard the Kelvin scale? Some of you? Okay. The Kelvin scale. You may have heard and learned about this in the chemistry class. Yeah, that same Kelvin, who's the reason why we have the Kelvin scale, to this day, he was also a Christian. In the 1900s, may not have heard of this guy, J.J. Thomson. He's a person responsible for discovering electrons and the first subatomic particles. He was also a Christian. And then I got this quote also. Says, the more I study science, the more I believe in God. You know who that was said by? Albert Einstein. And so you see a pattern here. For centuries, some of the greatest scientists in history didn't seem to choose between a belief in God and a belief in science. So why does it seem like we have to make that choice today? It's either one or the other. For some reason, the 21st century convinced all of us that Christians have to choose one side and people who aren't Christians have to choose the other side. And that Christians should be afraid of science because science is just too rational to line up with an invisible God. And this puts you and me in a really tough spot if we're believers in Christ. What if you could be really interested in and okay with science and still hold on to your faith? What if science and faith could actually relate? What if science doesn't necessarily disprove God? What if God is actually okay with science? So let's talk about it. So here's the thing. Much of the apparent disconnect that we have between science and faith is related to how things work. As more scientific discoveries are made, more elements are being discovered, we learn about how the world works. And the more things that are explained, the less it seems like we need God. Because if we understand more about science, then who needs God anymore? Because God is more just about faith, but if it just all makes sense, then I can just run after what makes sense. And the less likely we need to embrace the fact that God is even real. So over time, science focused on how things work. How things work. And the mystery about the universe decreased. Everyone started to make sense. We understand that the universe is expanding. We see how gravity works and the mass of the planets, all that stuff. And for some, it made it feel like God was less important because they just understand the universe so much more. But the difference between science and faith is that faith isn't trying to explain how. Faith is about understanding who. Faith is about understanding who, not the how. Science and faith have different goals, but many people don't realize it. They think that they butt heads, but they're going after two separate things, which is why when you sit in science class and you only learn how, that's the only thing that's mentioned. You might feel pressure of having to choose between the how of science and the who of your faith, but it doesn't have to be this way. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Kelvin, and Thomson didn't have to choose. And guess what? Neither do you. You don't have to choose between one or the other. See, as we begin this series on the relationship between faith and science, we have to take a minute and talk about who is behind everything in our universe. This is actually the exact place where the Bible starts. The Bible is a book full of historical stories, personal experiences from other people who believed and who trusted in God. And the first book of the Bible, most likely it was written by this man named Moses, and the way he explains how the way of the world came into being. So here's how it starts in the very start of creation, as it says here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created a lot more after that, but we're just going to sit on that one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, really? Come on, this proves nothing. But this is the exact kind of stuff that my science book says is just ridiculous. You expect me to think that science and faith can actually relate because of some ancient story that doesn't really explain anything about how everything came into being? The Bible takes a different look at the beginning, though. A look that focuses on who, not on how. As a result, there's been a lot of debate about how God created everything. And this conversation has led to some people to attempt to discredit God, saying, well, no, it's more about how. However, Genesis wasn't talking about how. The beginning of the Bible is more about who created than how it was created. The job of science is to explain how. The job of faith is to explain who. Although science does a great job with these explanations and experiments and all these other things to understand, these discoveries and theories that theories cannot answer one of humanity's greatest questions. Did all of this happen by chance? That's one of the greatest questions out there, and science cannot prove that. We've all wrestled with and wondered if we're just here by accident. How did I just show up? Well, that's where Genesis comes into play. The first sentence of the Bible is there to remind us God is the one who set creation in motion. No matter how much we discover about the how the universe works, it doesn't mean we can ignore the who is behind it all. What if the purpose of science isn't to disprove God, but instead teach us more about how God works? How he works. What if science actually teaches us how the who behind creation put everything together? What if God and science don't have to be worlds apart? What if they work together? What if the account of creation recorded in Genesis simply shows us that everything science explained isn't here by chance, but it is by design? And if you're still skeptical, that's okay. But just think about this for a minute, okay? Did you know that the earth is in perfect position to sustain life? It's rotating at a perfect speed and orbiting the sun in a perfect velocity to keep gravity in place and for us to be stuck here on this earth. Also, we're a perfect distance away from the sun. The moon is perfect distance away from the earth. And we're also tilted at a perfect angle to keep us safe from the sun's rays. If there is just a slight adjustment in the earth's angle, if there is a slight adjustment to the speed of the spinning of the earth, if there is a slight adjustment to going around the sun, our distance from the sun, even a slight adjustment from that, human life, and actually, in fact, all life would cease to exist. And maybe that was a perfect accident, but to be honest with you, I'm not buying that because I believe in God. I just can't bring myself to believe that a perfect placement of the earth and sun happened by random chance. I feel the same way about most things in creation, and that's why I love Genesis. I love the beginning story. I love the poetry of it. I love the stories of how God spoke things into existence. And it confirms that what I was already suspecting is that creation isn't random. It didn't just happen. There is a who behind our existence, and you can believe in him while still exploring the how of the science facts. How did it happen? Well, I don't know. I'm learning about that, but I can tell you who. This is why we should embrace both the how and the who. It's not just black and white. You have to choose one or the other, but that they can go hand in hand. If we treat them as enemies, we're missing out on the beauty of both of them. If we think we can't pay attention to the how of science, we miss the opportunity to learn more about who behind it. And if we ignore the who, we miss the purpose and significance of the how. And we just think it just all came randomly. Science and faith actually build each other up. They encourage each other. The how points to the who, and the who points to the how. Science can strengthen your faith in God, while God can use science to help you understand his work. So in other words, science and faith can exist in the same place. Science and faith can exist in the same place. Now, I realize that this might be a different approach than you were expecting to hear in church. A lot of times, maybe you grew up thinking that faith in God means that you have to ignore or discredit science. Or maybe you're in class and they start talking about all this stuff and you're like, no, that doesn't make sense because that goes against what I believe in God. And so, no, I can't believe in that. Maybe you didn't even grow up in church, but one of your hesitations in taking God seriously is your perception that the church is, they're old school when it comes to science and how the world works. Well, the good news is that you don't have to choose one or the other, that science and faith can go hand in hand. So how does this work? Well, instead of treating them like they're worlds apart and they're separate from each other, that science is way over here and faith is way over here and they cannot come together, we can allow them to share the same space. So when you go back into a science class this week, here's a step that you can take. You can put science and faith in their proper place. And because you're clear on the who, you're clear that, it is God who created, you can understand the how and learn more about the science. And you can start to sit there and it really points, like when you learn these crazy science facts and all these things that are working in the intricacies of how the human body works and how you just have a certain amount of water in your system and how the digestive system works and the blood circulates and how cells divide and all that stuff. When you learn about that, you can start to look at God and say, man, that's crazy that God thought of all that stuff. You can put science and faith in their proper place because you know the who, and now you're starting to learn the how. If you have any faith or trust that God exists or any belief that he might be out there, then it's worth exploring how everything works. And as you learn about how, always remember the who and who created it. And so as you sit in chemistry class or biology or physics or environmental science or any of that and learn the intricacies of how the universe works, remember who was behind it. And you praise him for his work. I remember when I was in college, my science class that I took astronomy. And I learned so much about like what was out in the universe and about nebulas and about stars and all these crazy intergalactic things. But in the class, we weren't just sitting there saying, well, this was just all by chance. I went to a Christian school, and so we were all sitting there and saying, isn't God beautiful? All this stuff is working. We're learning more about gravity and space and the universe and all that stuff. We're learning that the universe is expanding. But we can sit there and say, man, God is powerful. And all of that universe that I was learning about, God takes care of all of that. He's bigger than that. And that's what's crazy. And so when you do this, when you think about this, and you learn about the how of science, and you start to believe, man, God is the one who did it, you might be just blown away by God's power and creativity. Even if you're unsure about God right now, you might begin to grow in your confidence of who when you take time to discover the how. When you start to take time to discover how science works and all that other stuff, you start to see how powerful God is. So when you explore science with the belief that God is behind creation, then your response to science can be, oh, so that's how he did it. That's cool. Your faith can actually grow as you explore science. As you understand more about science, your faith can actually grow in understanding who God is and his character. This approach puts science and faith both in their proper place. So imagine if you didn't get hung up on the tension between faith and science, and you understood how they actually work together. And so as we wrap up, I'm sure that some of you guys might still have some skeptical questions. And maybe you have a million questions just running through your head, like, how does God do this? And why would he do that? And this, and how do you explain this? And maybe you even have reasons why all of this can be debated yourself. And if that's you, hear me out here. That's okay. The church, myself, the life group leaders that we have on Tuesday and Wednesday nights, we're not afraid of your questions. We want to have a safe place for you to ask the questions about faith. Because, and ask the questions about science. And like, so I've heard this before. How does this work within my relationship with God? We want you guys to ask these questions because what it does is it helps you get to a deeper level of faith. And here's the other thing. God's not afraid of your questions either. All throughout this series, your questions are going to be so important to just bring up. Talk about them. In fact, we want you to ask them week in and week out throughout the series for the next 3 weeks. And if you're still skeptical, I want you to come back Tuesday for high school or Wednesday for middle school. And we want you guys to be able to ask those questions, to be able to get some answers. Hopefully we have some answers. If not, I promise you we'll start researching and we'll start looking it up and find areas and ways that can answer your questions. But I want you guys to be able to take this series seriously and to be able to come on Tuesdays or Wednesdays and be able to ask the questions and be able to go deeper into it. So let me pray, and then we'll kind of move forward. Father God, I just thank you so much for this group that's here. And Father, I know that many of us probably struggle with this science and faith, and whether we're in middle school or high school, we probably have the questions of like, God, how does this work? This doesn't even make sense to me. So I pray that if anyone's saying that they're open to asking the questions and that they can go deeper in understanding more about who you are. God, we know that it's the who and not the how, and that they can still go hand in hand. So with all heads down and eyes closed, some of you might be asking that question, and you might be struggling with your relationship with God, or you might not even be believing in God because you are hearing all this stuff about science, but right now it's all starting to kind of connect and make sense, and you're starting to realize, man, I can have a relationship with Jesus and still understand science. I didn't ever see it that way. And if you want to give your life to Jesus and have a relationship right now with him for the first time, or maybe you want to come back to Jesus, with all heads down and eyes closed, I just ask that you just slip your hand up, and I want to pray for you. If that's any of you who are like, man, I want to do this right now. Any of you? All right, let me pray. Father God, I just thank you so much. And you are so good, and we trust you. And I just pray that during this series that we grow. We grow in our understanding of you, and that we're challenged in our faith. We love you, Jesus, and pray this in your name. Amen.